Okay, and welcome to week 3 of this wonderful graphics and animation class. And I hope all of you are having a wonderful time learning how to do this. I've also seen a few of your first assignments coming in, and I'm happy that a lot of you are understanding the format. And there's one thing that I wanted to emphasize before we get started, is that when you send a file to me, it has to be a bitmap file. So let me just sort of paint in the air here. When you start with the project, the first thing you're going to create is a model. A model is nothing but math. It's a geometric shape. And so it's also in a format that only Lightwave understands. So if you send me that file, maybe I'll be able to open it, but I won't get most of the nuances because some of that stuff is stored in other files that only you actually have. So you take that into layout. That's step number 2. Layout understands the model. Now the problem is, if you send me the layout file, that's not going to make any sense because you have to send me the model with it. So the layout file still is proprietary Lightwave. Now from layout, that is where you render. Render is when you take a picture of your model. And so that picture is not a 3D model at all. It's a bitmap image. That's what you need to send me, because that is what you would send to the client. You never send your models to the client for many reasons, one of which is they can steal your work and then they don't have to pay you anymore. You send your images so that you can solve their problems, whatever it is that they're going to do, because they're just buying the images. That's all they really care about. And so that is why you have to send me the image file. And so the other factor is this simple compatibility. Again, any 3D images that you send me are not going to be compatible if I don't happen to be using Lightwave at the time. And I will not attempt to open your model files. So go ahead and send me the image. Now, the last thing I'll say about that is be sure to send me a PNG file. That is the easiest one to use, takes up the least amount of space, has the most functionality. Okay, so here we are. This week we're going to be talking about multi-layered objects, going into a little bit more detail. Also, we're going to be introducing some things that you can do with layers that we haven't really talked about before. And we're also going to be talking about image mapped surfaces, because that's an incredibly useful thing. We've already introduced it a little bit, especially in the tutorials. So now we're going to actually go more in depth as to how that works. Okay, so layers and their uses. You can create moving parts with layers. And what I mean by that is that you can have, let's say, an axle with a wheel on it. The wheel is a moving part. It turns against the axle. You can create doors with hinges. You can create buildings that have windows that open and things like that. And so all of those things could be on different layers. You can also create components. You can have, let's say, an eyeball that has an iris and a pupil, and it has the outside of it, the optic nerve. You can create all of those things. And all of those may have different surfaces. And we're going to talk about today, particularly this week, is the Boolean add and subtract. And so this is going to sound scarier than it is. Don't worry about it. We're also going to be talking about saving layers as objects. So in other words, if you have an object that has multiple layers and you don't want to look at each layer individually, you want to look at it as a whole thing, you can then save that as a secondary object that contains all the information, so that you don't have to worry about the layers. And if you do that, for example, let's say you have a race car model. It's got all the wheels and everything like that. If you save that as a single object with all the layers merged together, the wheels wouldn't turn. The program wouldn't understand it as wheels anymore. But if you just want to have it parked by the side of the road, it's not going to be that difficult to manipulate. Whereas if you have all the layers together, every time you want to move it, you may have to select all that stuff. Maybe that's not what you want to do. Okay, we're also going to talk about exporting layers. So if you wanted to do this, you could send each component somewhere else or to another model, for example. And so all kinds of things there. Now, Boolean, because that's what probably one of the most tricky things we're going to get into this week. Don't let the name scare you. I'm not exactly sure why they call it this, because Boolean sounds like a math term, which it is, of course. And really what we're talking about is merging or subtracting one shape from another. And if you think of it that way, really it's not all that scary. So you don't even have to think of it as math. You're just thinking, you got a shape here, you got a shape here, and you're going to punch a hole in this shape using this shape, or you're going to add one shape to another shape. in which case instead of having 2 layers, you might have one object that contains 2 layers, or that looks like it has 2 layers, whether it does or not. It's not perfect and not always necessary. For example, you could in fact just merge all the layers that you have together into one object if you don't want to manipulate them separately anymore, and there you are. It could be that that's all you need to do. Maybe you don't need to Boolean weld them together, so to speak. Subtract is more useful. I think you're going to find if you're going to use Boolean, subtract is really the way to go, because that's because all objects start out as solid. And when you Boolean subtract something, you keep the solidity, but you add a little bit of internal dimensions. For example, if you wanted a hollow box, all you would have to do is take another box and subtract it from the inside, and then make windows into it. You can make all kinds of interesting shapes that way. And what I want to warn you ahead of time is that this isn't perfect. Avoid subtracting near complex geometry. So the Boolean subtract feature, it can be annoying. Sometimes you have to play around with it. You got to dicker with it. If you try to subtract it, sometimes you'll get impossible geometry, or sometimes a surface will disappear. And when that happens, you may have to go back and start moving points around to see if you can get the surface back. Because what's happening is some plane that has that surface can no longer be supported. It becomes impossible. Sometimes a point has moved to some degree. So if you move the point back or merge it with another point, suddenly the problem's solved. But I find that rather than hunting that down, which can take a long time, just undo what you did, move the thing ever so slightly and try it again, see if it works. Okay, so to understand Boolean, the best way I can think of doing is to demonstrate it. And so let's talk about how you would go about doing this. Now here we are in Modeler. And so I'm going to make a box here. And I'll make it a relatively simple box, but we have a certain amount of flexibility. So I'm going to hit the N for my numeric pad, which takes me here. And in this particular case, I don't really care about the dimensions, but I will center it. There we go. And I will also create that radius. I'll make a little bit of a, in fact, I'll make it more pronounced than usual, like that. And I'll give it a nice rounded edge. And so if you look at it over here, you can see that we have kind of a fuzzy box. Now I've deliberately made it not a standard shape. So this is kind of like a rectangular box. Looks like the sort of thing like a computer CPU might come in, but let's start with that. Okay, so that's going to be my box, and I'm just going to go ahead and close numeric pad. I'm going to turn off box, and you'll notice that all of my geometry is on the edges, and so I've got these big planar shapes that have that are completely open. So if you look at the box, the computer sees that as a solid object, meaning that if I were to move in on this, eventually I'm going to go through it. And so I'm actually inside it now. And if I back up a little bit, I can begin to see the object again. So there's an inside and an outside. And right now the inside is an empty universe. Now let me show you something that I don't want you to fall into. Let's say I go over here into polygon mode. I say, well, what if I wanted to make that an open box? And so I'm going to click on a polygon. And so in this particular case, it's a little tricky. So let me just start that again so we can get this right. Let's say I move in on this, and I'm going to try to click on the edge of that box. And I've got it, except I took a little piece with me. See from this other little line there? So I'm just going to scoot over there and try it again. That time I took more with it. So if I hit the part that I took, okay, so there I can see that I've only got that one plane. Now, of course, we also know one thing. If I'm looking at it from above, I've also got this below, you see? So that's the top, that's where I'm seeing here. But I've also got the bottom part, so I don't want to select that. So I'm going to deselect the bottom. So right now, if I look at my model here, I've only got the top selected. So let's say that I want to make that a nice hollow box so I can put things in it. So the first thing I might do is just delete that polygon. So once I've done that, look what I have created. I have created a mess, an abomination, because I have created a hole into an empty universe. So I'm going to save this at the moment, save the object. And so I'm going to call this, let's say, case. So now I've saved that as an object. And if I open up Lightwave, or Layout rather, and there's Layout. If I go into Perspective View, which I usually do, and I load this object, case, you'll see that if I look at this, I've got a real problem if I want to use that object for anything. Because the moment I look up, all of the insides of the object vanish. It becomes this hole into an empty dimension. And the bottom would be visible if there was a light down there. So I literally have a box that has impossible geometry built into it. Now, let's say that I was given that and I have to use it. What I would have to do is look at the object only from the points where it looks correct. So if I'm doing something for print where I'm not going to have to animate, I can have problems and parts of the object that are not visible, but that's not a good practice to get into, trust me. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to Control Z that. So now I've got my object back, and if I go back to Layout, now you see it has its surface there. So you might say, well, what if I want to have a nice empty box? Well, the simple fact is you don't want to do it that way because you want to have a box that makes sense. So if you were to basically remove one piece of geometry from there, you would have walls that are literally impossibly thin. And so it wouldn't make sense. It'd be like a broken Christmas tree ornament, very sharp. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create the inside of the box as well. So if I go back here, I'm going to deselect what I've done there, and I'm going to show you a really, really easy way of doing this. If I want to make a hollow box, I'm going to go into polygon mode and select every polygon. The whole thing is selected. I'm going to go to Edit Copy. Then I'm going to go up here, make a second layer. I'm going to put the first layer up in Preview, and I'm going to go Edit Paste. And so when I do that, suddenly I will have one box superimposed over another. And so what I'm going to do here is I want to use this box to represent the internal volume of the object. So in order to do that, I have to make this smaller than the outside. So I'm not selecting anything now, which means I'm selecting everything. And I'm going to go down here where I'm going to go to Modify. I'm just going to go to Size. Now you could do this more than one way. We'll start with Size. If I scoot the size down, you can see that I have made that box smaller. And so the advantage of using that tool is it reduces all dimensions at the same time. So if I Control Z that, and I would instead do Stretch, I have a little bit more control because I'm only stretching it by the dimensions that I'm using at the time. Now, if you want to do it that way, you can. I'm going to just send that back the way it was because I think size is a little bit easier to do at this point. And I'm just going to move that. And now moving it, you can see that the box is almost right, but here, at least on these edges, we got a little bit of an issue. So I will go back to Stretch at that point, and I will kind of nudge that. And so if I'm looking at it from above, I can see that my inner box is just about centered. That looks pretty good here too. That looks pretty good there too. So now I've got a box within a box. And so what I want to do is I want to use the Boolean control to literally remove one box from the other. So first thing, I'm going to turn off move, so all of my controls are normal. Then I'm going to go here and I'm going to go to the original box and I'm going to put the box I'm cutting with in the background. Now that's important to remember. Whatever it is that you're subtracting or adding always has to be in the background. So now we're ready to go. So I'm going to go to Construct, which is there's not much else on here that I typically use. I'm just going to go to Boolean. It's right here. Under Construct, we got Boolean. And then Boolean, I've got a few options. Subtract is the most useful one. And you can also add, but let's just stick with subtract right now. If I hit OK, you'll notice it looks like I've created another box. It looks like both boxes are in the foreground. Now here's the trick. If I look around this object, I don't see any difference because I've only subtracted from the inside. So if you want to see the inside, you've got to cut a window into it. So I'm going to go over here to my second layer. I don't need this anymore. I'm never going to need this again. I'm just going to delete it. And I'm going to create some sort of an opening. So here, what I can do is I can go to create a box. And I'm just going to draw a box here. And I don't have to even be perfect about it. I'm just going to put the box up like that. And that will have that little curvature that's in there. And so then I'm going to put my big box in the foreground and put that box in the background. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go to Boolean, subtract, boom. So then if I look only at this, I can see, and it appears to have worked. It's not perfect, but it's there. I now have a box that has an internal shape. I'm going to show you something real quick. Turn off box here because I don't need that anymore. If I go over to layout, now layout has updated. You'll see that second box is there. We don't really want that anymore. But it's going to put that there because it sees that as one of the layers. So if you're going to do this, typically you've got to get rid of your layers when you're done with them, or turn them off in Lightwave if you don't want to see them. Turn them off in layout rather. But if you look here, we now have a box that has an internal volume, in which case you can put things in there. And that can be of use to you. Now there's another trick that I can show you. Let's say without doing any more cutting, you go back here, and I'm going to go, and now it's not as easy as it used to be. If I zoom in on this, I'm going to stay in polygon mode. I'm going to grab that polygon that I grabbed before, not the same one actually, but I want to grab the edge of that polygon, and I'm going to get rid of everything but that square. So now we're looking at it from the front, and I want to get rid of the rear one. Just the front is what I want. So I got the front, and this time, well, maybe that is, okay. Well, it'll work. We'll figure it out. So if that's the front surface there, if I were to change the surface name, I'm going to call this window. Window. So if I do that, I will have a surface that's called default surface, and I'll have a surface called window. Doesn't look like anything's different here. But if I go to my surface editor, there's my default surface. Where is my window surface? Well, I'm going to save it if it didn't come up the first time. Save object. So if I go back here, there it is, window. So we have an aspect of this that has a separate surface. So for example, if I want to prove that, I can give that a different color, and there it is. So if I'm looking at it in layout, I can see that we've got a different color on that side of the box. But what if I wanted to make that surface slightly transparent? Here's where it may get interesting. This may work for us or against us. If I go into transparency and begin bringing that up a little bit, you can see that I can actually create a window that looks into the box. Now the problem with that is that I've created impossible geometry yet again. So this wouldn't really be the way to do it, but it would be a discussion of how you could do it. For example, I could also add specularity if I wanted to create the effect of a window, and I could even put some glossiness in there. It doesn't show up with the lighting currently there, but that could be useful. Just out of curiosity, if I put it in VPN, you can see that you can see the window, and take it off VPR. If I were to take that light and move it back, I would move the light back a little bit. That didn't really help. One more thing, if I go to Surface Editor, I could put in reflection, see what it would reflect. Yeah, we're getting some reflection there, not useful reflection. Okay, well, enough of that to start with. This is essentially the idea of how you would use Boolean subtract to create something. Now, Boolean add is a whole other ballgame. That is where you're sort of merging objects together. And there's a whole tutorial on that in which I make a set of jacks, which I'm including this week, so we won't bother with that here. Moving parts. Your objects have moving parts. You can basically add one layer to another, create some incredible applications. 3D printed objects can also include mechanisms. You can have parts that you design that move against each other. You can have multiple parts that fit, interlock, and fit in. And I can't stress enough how important it is to understand how that works, because the potential is enormous. Understanding pivot points. If you've got more than one object or more than one part to an object and you want it to move together, you have to understand you're going to move the pivot point in such a way it works, and we'll demonstrate that today. And of course, you can animate and demonstrate anything that you want using this technology. So here we are. We're looking at a scene in Lightwave layout. Now, this scene was never actually used for anything. Let me explain what I mean. What we're looking at is a concept of a vehicle. So I'm going to go from VPR to texture shaded so you can see it a little bit better. And you might say, well, why did I make it look so ugly? There's no color in it or anything. Well, there's one very simple reason for that. This was never intended to be part of an animation per se. It was intended to be 3D printed. And it actually printed rather well. And so it was part of a larger model design. But I wanted this to be the flying car with the doors that opened up to the side. And at the size that I printed, it actually looked pretty good. So this is the model as you would see it in layout, or I'm sorry, in Modeler. Now, if you look at this, you can see you get all the details there. Look at how many layers I have, though. Those are all layers. And also, I've got another bank of them over here. So I've got a whole slew of layers because each of those components would be on one layer. Because I want to be able to work at them separately. If you were to scoot in on this and look at all those different things, it would be difficult to work on any one aspect of that without messing around with anything else, especially because we have an exterior and an interior. So if I go here in the beginning, if I click on layer 1, you can see that that is the bucket, the base of the car. Layer 2 would be part of a wall between one compartment and another. You got part of the dashboard there. And if I hold shift click on layer 3, that's the, I guess you call those pitons that it sits on. And if you keep going, you get more components there, some of which aren't really all that important. This was the shell, which include the windows. And that was a shape that started out as a rectangle. And I used Boolean to get the shape of the windows there. And headlights, and one door, pads that it lands on, this is the interior seating, and then from there we've got the bulbs in the headlights if you want the bulbs to glow, and some other small component, a dome on top, and this was to do a rather interesting job. I'm going to turn that off for a minute, and I'm going to put this on. This is the door in the open position. I wanted to print out this door in the open position. Now the problem is, if you're 3D printing, it starts from the bottom and works its way up. And so that means that aspects of this are flying out in space. So I created this very thin wall to allow the 3D printer to build some plastic to base this on. And so that's one way of doing it, and that's how it worked. And it actually did work. Okay, so this was a very small print that was never actually designed to be seen in great detail. But what I want to show you now is if I wanted to animate this, I want to be able to make that door open and close. Because if I wanted to do this as a larger model with moving parts, I wouldn't make this unless I had a way to make that door open and close. You ever get those toy cars when you were younger maybe, or even not so young, and then you go to try to open the doors and they don't open? And you say, well, gee, that's a cheap car. I like it when the little doors open. Why? Who knows? So I like little doors to open, so we're going to make them open. So if I go over here, this is the same model now in layout, and I'm going to be able to animate it so that the door opens. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this. I don't really want that there anymore because we're not 3D printing it now. So here's where it gets a little messy. If you look down here, and I'm going to confess to you that I did a horrible job here. The machine is called Big Hopper, and I've got layers 1 through 15. Now, what's on layer 7? I don't remember. I just basically had to guess. And so, since I was only 3D printing this, I didn't have to worry about this. But I can tell you that on layer 15, that's the door. And on layer 14, that's this thing. So I'm going to go to Items, and I'm going to go to Clear Selected. So I'm going to make that go away. And so the dialog box, clear Big Hopper layer 14 from the scene, yes, gone. So now we've got the door in the open position. And so I want to be able to fold that door down. And this is something you actually would do in layout. Because if you're going to do it in Modeler, then it's folded down forever. And so the model starts out in this position. I want to be able to fold the door down as part of an animation. And so that's easy. As the door is selected, I go over to Modify, and then I go to Rotate, and down here I've got my little rotate rings. You can see that. I know it's kind of hard to see. And I'll tell you what, let me just move in just a little bit so it's a little easier to see. And maybe expand in on it some. Okay, so those are my rotate rings. And the little green one, look what happens when I do that. Oh, geez, wow. So I would imagine that doesn't work. And the reason is because that's just not the way doors open. So if you were to, in fact, I've seen it worse, depending on how big the model is. And so what's happening is the pivot point for that object is down here, and the door is up there. And so we've got to move that pivot point to make this work. And so this is one of the things that comes up with multi-layer objects. And this comes up typically in layout. So if I go to Modify here, Move, Pivot. So you see I can move the object. If I just go to Move, I can move that door anywhere I want, but it's not going to make sense as a door. Now if I move the pivot, you see I've got my little move arrows here, and I can move that up, and I can move it over a bit. Here's the blue one. And then you'll notice as you rotate it, you begin to see, I'll just move this over here. As you rotate, you begin to see that you got to fine tune that. So that looks better now. And let's see if there's any other mistakes. Okay, I got it pretty close. Okay, so there's my wonderful thing here. So now, if I rotate it, probably not perfect, but it works. So let me show you, give me kind of a look ahead here. If I go Control Z, that is what I'm starting with. And so I'm going to make a very short animation. So this scale here is our timeline. So right now we're at 0. I'm going to move this to frame 30. So 1 second. Then I'm going to rotate on that pivot point, and I'm going to shut the door. So the door is now shut. So if I say shut the door shuts. Now, it's not perfect because we have geometry coming out of geometry, And the reason why it's not perfect is because the door was never originally designed to be moved. It was originally designed to always be in the open position, and it was a small enough model that you wouldn't really notice the geometry problems here. And so, in order to fix that, I would have to round that off, and I would have to design it very differently. But this is a short example of how you would do this. Okay, so I wanted to demonstrate one thing real quick. If you didn't want to do a Boolean subtract, but wanted to do a Boolean add, or you had a complex object where you wanted to save a bunch of individual layers as one, let me show you why that would be advantageous. So as you see, this object is a very large and complex thing. And so what we're going to do is, let's say we look over here, and remember we've got this piece here that we absolutely don't need. So all I'm going to do is go ahead and turn that off. So I hold down the Shift key, and I just go ahead and blank that out. So now these are all of the layers that I want. Now if I were to send this to layout as it is, so if I go and click this little corner here, I don't use this all that often because I prefer to do it manually. If I send object to layout, then there it is. Now remember, as we said here, this is not always the perfect solution, so there I'm in layout, and look, I've got all of these layers here. So the first thing I might do is just get rid of layer 14. So if I just go up into items, and I go to items, and I go into clear selected, then I'll clear one layer from the object. But obviously this is going to be a real pain. So for example, if I wanted to move something, if I go to modify move, in order for this to work, I'd have to select all the objects that I wanted to move, and I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to show you that if you're in Modeler, and I've turned on only the layers that I want. If I go to File, Save Layers as Object, I'm just going to go ahead and just call this car. I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to go to layout, and I'm going to hit right here. All I'm going to do is I'm going to go to items. I'm just going to clear all objects, just everything, just blow it all away. And then I'm going to go here and load an object, and I'm going to load car, and you'll see that car does not have that piece that we don't want. It also only has one layer. So if I then want to modify that, I might rotate it. I'm rotating the whole thing. So if I wanted to make that door work, in this particular case I couldn't, because it is now part of the whole object. And so I would have to redo that to make it work. But if I just wanted this thing as a background piece that's just sitting somewhere, this would be the way to do it. Now, scene building is something that goes a little further than that. Scene building, we go away from the 3D printer. Here we're talking about, making like a cartoon, some sort of a movie or demonstration. And so for that, you have to think of it as a scene. And so you have to include everything, because remember, the studio comes empty. So your layout gives you empty space. You've got to put the walls and floor there separately, and it's not as hard as you might imagine. And there's a tutorial that demonstrates how you would do that. And there I demonstrate how you make the jack game with the ball and the jacks. You also have to consider lighting, what you're going to do with lighting. Image maps, and that's going to be the last major topic for this week. I want to demonstrate how you would in fact map a bitmap onto the surface of an object. And this is kind of, it's different than applying a simple texture where you're deciding whether you want the object to be shiny, what color you want it to be. If all you're doing is talking about the exterior of a car, maybe color's fine. But what if you want to talk about something that's got a visible surface, something that's got more than one color, for example, or something like that? Image maps save you an enormous amount of time. It allows for photorealism. It's a shortcut. It's a very easy thing to do, and it gives you a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak. It's not perfect, but it's still useful. Now, we're going to talk later about something called UV surfaces that are a whole lot better, but this will get you started. And so you're wrapping an image around the object. It can be almost anything. And you're going to want to consider how you're going to do that based on the shape of the object. Sometimes you don't need all that much. Sometimes you need more. And it's not just color. You can also create a bump map, as they call it, meaning the object would appear to have a texture, and that can be useful. Okay, so here we are again in Modeler. And so what we want to do is establish an object that we're going to apply a texture to. And I want to come up with something simple, something really simple. So what I want to do is I want to make a brick. And so I'm going to go up here into Create. I'm going to create a box because a brick is basically just a box. Now we still have some of the leftover stuff from last time. Now this wouldn't look like a particularly good brick at this point because it's way too clean and everything. So the first thing we want to do is we want to give that brick a rough edge. So if I go into numeric pad, or when I say rough edge, I basically mean I want to get rid of this beautiful geometry that it comes with. So we're going to get rid of all that. So we're going to have a hard edge brick. And in actuality, we may want to give it some, because most bricks are a little bit it's this one here. We'll give it just a suggestion of an edge there, which we can work on later. And that's all we're going to do. We're not going to talk about carving the brick or anything like that. We're just going to basically start with that. And in this particular case, I'm only going to give it one surface. I'm not going to bother having one side of the brick a different color than the other side, but this is what we're starting with. And so I'm going to save this object, and I'm just going to call this brick. So now we have an object called brick, and then I'm going to go over to layout. So here I am in layout, and I'm going to load that brick in. I'm going to load the object. There's my brick, and there it is. Nice, big, huge brick. And so right now it doesn't look anything at all like a brick, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time making it look like a brick. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to reach out and grab a brick. So if I go to my internet, so here I am on Google, I'm just going to type in brick surface, because you're going to find that a lot of people are doing this. Brick surface texture. Let's see what they'll give me for brick surfaces. If I go to images, and you see a lot of them. So all I really want is the texture of that brick. So I don't want bricks, I just want one brick, and there's several to choose from here. So let's say I go with this one. That's got a kind of a brick texture to it, and that's really all it is. Now this one may be a watermarked image, which is okay. We will ignore that fact. So I'm going to save that image, and I'm going to keep the whole file name. And there it is. So if I'm in layout now, I can have some fun with this. So I'm going to go into Surface Editor, and there is my brick. And for some reason it's named Window, probably because it remembers something I did before. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to go here first to where it says Color, and then I could choose a color for it, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to go ahead and go into this Texture tab, and go to Image Map. And so for the texture, I'm going to choose Image Map. There's a few others we could choose. We're going to stick with that. And I'm just going to go down here where it says Planar. I'm going to choose Cubic because we're talking about a three-dimensional square object. Then I'm going to load an image. Where it says Image, I'm going to load that image. And we can see it's right there. And let's see what happens when we do that. When we do that, it looks like it got it, at least for the most part. Let's look around it a bit. Maybe not perfect. I'm just going to hit automatic sizing and see if that works up a little bit, because that way it will try to distribute that surface nice and evenly. Now, right now it's not perfect, but we may be getting somewhere. Now, if I go here and choose VPR, I can see that I've got something of a surface. And it may not be a perfect brick surface, but it's a start. Now, if we use the texture, which we will for now, if I were to look at this, first of all, if I change specularity, then it looks less like a brick unless it's a polished brick. So we don't want any specularity or glossiness or anything like no reflection, no transparency. We want it as ugly as possible, but we also want that brick surface. So what I want to do is I want to go to where it says bump, way down here, And I'm going to apply the exact same texture. And so in this case, it will also be cubic. And I'm going to choose the same image. This time I'm not loading an image. And I'm going to hit automatic sizing, so it will make it the same as the other one. And I'm even going to add a little amplitude. Where it says texture amplitude, that just gives it a little bit of a bump there. So it can actually make a big difference. And let's see what happens when I do that. So if I've looked at that, I can even further amplify it down here where it says bump. I can make that even more bumpy. And so if I look in on that, I can see that the surface is actually coming across. Now, I'd have to really work on this to get it right, but you can begin to see that this object appears to have a deformed surface. Now, there's ways of taking it even further so that it looks more realistic, but at the moment, that may be enough for many applications. If all I want to do is to create the effect of a brick, that could do it. You could also add what's called a deform map to make it look even more realistic. But let's just stick with this now. So this would be a way of creating a brick. And then once I've done that, just to sort of finish up here, if I turn off VPR, go back to texture surface, I'll go out a little bit. What about if I were to then say load object? I'm going to load brick again. So now I've got 2 bricks. And let's say I move the brick over a little bit. I could load another one, or I could duplicate it. Let's say I want to clone the object. So I'll clone current item, and I'm going to make 3 clones. So 3 clones of the current item would allow me to do this. I could basically go down here and create that, put that there like that, and go back here, and I got another one. And then from there, I've got another clone there. And any more? I think that may be it. Nope. So there are my bricks. And if I look at it like this, and put it into VPR. Now I've got the effect of a kind of a broken brick wall. If you wanted to create ruins, you can. And if the bricks look pretty much the same, that's okay. You can also create more than one style of brick, let's say. But that would be creating a kind of a scene. And if you wanted to create a landscape for it to live on, all you'd have to do is put that on some sort of a terrain. Okay, we're going to talk about standards now. Standards I sometimes call production values. If you're making an object, do it right. First thing I'm going to say is go beyond the basics. The basics are the primitives. You got the primitives down. We don't need to worry about that. That was last week. So last week, send me a primitive, maybe a little bit of work, and that's fine. But now I'm asking you to go a little further. I'm asking you to use the Boolean. I'm asking you to use some bitmap surface. I'm asking you to play around a bit, because we're going to get into some more interesting stuff as we go along. But we have to get the nuts and bolts down, and we have to get that little core of understanding together so that we can take these steps together. Stretch your skills. Don't just take the easy way out. Try to think of something that you actually want to invest your time into. Build castles in the sky. Worry about the bricks later. That's how I used to say when I was in college. Try to come up with something that you don't even think you can do, and then find a way to do it. Because you can. This stuff is actually, once you get into it, it's not as hard as it seems. Display your work with pride. Make sure that, like for example, if you're going to send me a bitmap image of your work, maybe you can send me 2 bitmaps, maybe one from a different point of view. So just to demonstrate how wonderful your work is. Because if you don't like your work, why would anybody else? Okay, so that's it for the lecture material this week. I'm going to ask that you submit your next object to be something in which you've done some Boolean work and possibly used an image map. You don't necessarily have to do both, but you have to do one or the other, or both. It's up to you. Try to impress yourself and impress me.